680 WRKO. It is the Cooner Report. No, this is not Jeff Cooner. It is Chris Culkeen having the pleasure of sitting in studio today. Thank you to Brittany and for Bill Cooksey for holding my hand through the program, and for all the callers that have helped out as well. We are going to switch to a subject right now, and we have a special guest on with us this morning to talk about a new book, Nixon's Secrets. He's being brought to you by South Shore Bank. And welcome to the program, Roger Stone. Welcome to WRKO.
I am delighted to be here.
Glad to have you. Of course, President Nixon, one of the most polarizing presidents that we've had. I think that would be easy to say.
Sure, but he remains the subject of public interest because he's so complicated, so complex. He's such an internal contradiction because he makes enormous mistakes, but He also achieves great things for the country.
He's often referred to as a Greek tragedy figure in that he was had so much going for him, was a brilliant man, yet that inner voice that he would hear caused him so much anguish.
Well, his deep resentments drive his, extremely disciplined ambition. I mean, this is a guy who revives his entire career 3 times after being written off for dead. So there's an enormous resilience there, a relentlessness, perseverance that I think is an admirable quality. Look, I have a tattoo of Nixon on my back, about the size of a grapefruit. It's like a floating head between my shoulder blades.
Oh, well, thank you for the TMI right there.
But it's not an ideological statement. What it is a reminder that in life, when things don't go your way, when you suffer defeats, when you get knocked down, you got to get yourself back up, dust yourself off, and get back in the game. That's really the story of Richard Nixon, who succeeds in the long term despite the ups and downs and controversies of his career, ends up an elder statesman advising Bill Clinton on foreign affairs.
Well, let's take it back a step, Roger. Let's talk about your involvement and how you became an aide at the White House during the Nixon administration. Tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, I was very junior. I first went to the White House as an intern at 18, clipping newspaper clippings in the press shop under the indirect supervision of Patrick J. Buchanan. I parlayed that into a job at the committee Re-elect the President, essentially by brown-nosing Jeb Magruder enough to hire me. I was 19. I really didn't get to know the president on an intimate basis until his post-presidential years. By then, I had worked 3 elections for Ronald Reagan, handling the northeastern states, and developed a very close and intimate relationship with former President Nixon, who had a voracious appetite for political gossip and intelligence. So I really got an opportunity to spend a substantial amount of time with the former president. He was not very retrospective, in his nature. He was very forward-looking. He didn't really want to talk about the past. He wanted to talk about the future. But when he had a cocktail or two, that's all it really took. He could become loquacious, and you could talk about Kennedy or Eisenhower or Cuba or the 1960 election and all the things that, of course, interested me.
He had it would seem, quite a hatred for the Kennedy family.
Well, he had good reason. I think I put the 1960 election in some perspective because the Theodore White making of the president in 1960 narrative is very romantic. The dashing, ethical John F. Kennedy versus the black-hatted villain Richard Nixon. But the truth is, the Kennedys wiretapped Nixon's hotel suite on the eve of the Nixon-Kennedy debate. The Kennedys broke into Nixon's psychiatrist's office to steal his medical records. The Kennedys broke into his accountant's office in Los Angeles to steal his financial records. The Kennedys wiretapped the Republican National Committee. The Kennedys get a pass. They didn't play clean.
Well, they certainly, gangster. Yeah, they certainly get a pass around here, don't they?
Yeah, no, particularly there, and I understand this is sensitive locally, but let's get to it. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy was a gangster. He was a bootlegger, and he bought the presidency for his lightweight playboy son, who really didn't, other than working against civil rights in the Senate, Jack Kennedy really didn't have much of a record.
Well, let's go back to Nixon himself and how you got involved in the campaign.
Well, I was hired as a campaign scheduler, working on the schedule of the First Family. But in that context, I got to know most of the central figures of Watergate. I knew Gordon Liddy. I knew Jeb Magruder. I knew Richard Kleindienst. I knew a number of these players on a very casual basis. More importantly, I got to know Murray Schottner, who was really the behind-the-scenes gray eminence. And from afar, I got to see John Dean, and I must tell you, he's a real piece of work. I mean, here, 40 years after resignation, he still hasn't come up with the truth. He's put out a new book that he says is the definitive account, which is based on 423 new tape transcripts that he won't let anyone see.
It's just what he has.
Yes,
right.
and he completely truncates, or more importantly, omits the conversations between he and Nixon of March 13th, 16th, 17th, and 20th. Now, all of those are 100% about the Watergate break-in, but what you hear, if you listen to them, and I have them online, is John Dean, a lawyer, urging his client to break the law, to commit crimes. Nixon doesn't suck Dean into the cover-up. Dean sucks Nixon into the cover-up.
But ultimately, he does get involved in that. But let me ask you, and by the way, we're speaking with Roger Stone, author of the new book, Nixon Secrets. It's hard to believe. It's 40 years after the president resigned. When he loses to John Kennedy and he retreats back to California, and as you've talked about, he reinvents himself. Do you go to that process? Tell us about that process that he went through personally and then ultimately as a candidate who went on to win the White House.
Well, first of all, he believes that the 1960 election was stolen from him, and with some very good reason.
In what way? I mean, you
widespread voter theft in not only Chicago, which would not turn the election, just make it closer, but more importantly, Texas. A great deal of detail in my book about voter theft in Texas.
How do they go about doing that? Back then?
In Texas, they had a state law that said when you went into the paper ballot, there'd be like 10 candidates for president. You had to cross off the names of those you weren't for and leave the name of the one you were for unmarked. Well, if you circled Nixon Lodge in the counties controlled by Lyndon Johnson, that ballot was invalidated. In the other counties, there was never one standard. In the other counties, the counties that were either neutral or controlled by the Republicans, that ballot was counted. Then, since there is no recount law in Texas, Johnson burned 58,000 Nixon Lodge ballots on election night in Dallas County alone. Kennedy only carried Texas by 46,000 votes. I go into great detail. I just gave you the short version. But, yeah, in any event, Nixon believed the election was stolen from him. And I think that feeds the resentment and anger that brings us to Watergate, the paranoia, if you will. He goes to California. He decides to try to maintain a political base. He runs for governor. He's on a trajectory to win. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis hits the fan. All of the oxygen is sucked in the air. The American people, of course, rally behind President Kennedy in that controversy, and Nixon loses. He then has his angry press conference. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore, says he's out of politics. 6 years later, he's sworn in as President of the United States.
And how he gets there, of course, you go into more detail. I want to jump further down the line, though, because you talk about what he is most remembered for in the resignation that ultimately took place 40 years ago. But you believe that was all orchestrated as well.
Well, I think he died by his own hand in the sense that the Central Intelligence Agency learned about the Watergate break-in, and I believe they infiltrated the burglar team and purposely sabotaged the break-in so that they would get caught. Why? The CIA and the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs were opposed to withdrawal of Vietnam, opposed to the China Initiative, opposed particularly to the arms control agreement with the Soviets. In Nixon, kind of like with Kennedy, they thought they were getting a hardliner, and when he became pro-peace and pro-détente, it really blew their minds. So I actually argue that they planned twice to assassinate him, as they played a role in the assassination of Kennedy, in my opinion, and as I wrote in my previous book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. I think they fail in that endeavor, but ultimately they help take Nixon down by exacerbating the boneheaded break-in into the Watergate into a national scandal.
Regardless of that, though, I mean, Nixon did have some dirt on his hands. There's no question about it.
No question. He joins the cover-up. But 9 months after John Dean says he does, he makes egregious mistakes. He should have fired everybody involved. There's no evidence that he knew about the break-in in advance. It had no purpose. He was leading McGovern by 19 points on his way to a 49-state blowout. So why did they need to break into the Watergate?
Yeah, what was the one state? What was the one state that didn't vote for him?
Massachusetts.
I remember we had a poster in our house. It was a caricature of Richard Nixon with an American flag with a pair of scissors cutting one star out of the flag after that election.
Right now, all my relatives in Holyoke are jumping up.
Okay. Well, I do want to take that, too, because you mentioned something about Richard Nixon using information about Gerald Ford in order to win his pardon. Tell us about that whole scenario.
Yeah, I believe, first of all, that Vice President Spiro Agnew is maneuvered out of the way. I think they set him up. He ultimately pleads to a very minor tax infraction, but they get him out of the line of succession because he won't pardon Nixon. Mm-hmm. Nixon chooses Gerald Ford for vice president because Nixon knows that in 1964, Gerald Ford is the man who altered the John F. Kennedy autopsy in the Warren Commission. Congressman Gerald Ford was a member of that commission, and Nixon also knows that the Kennedy administration was widely involved in both wiretapping illegally and the assassination of foreign leaders. So he really sends a message to Jerry Ford: if I go to trial, everybody's going down with me. We're going to open up the connections between the Bay of Pigs and the Kennedy assassination. We're going to point out, Jerry, that you changed the autopsy at the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, which, by the way, Ford does in his own handwriting. And that document is declassified by the federal government in 1996. So this is reported in the New York Times and the Associated Press that Ford changed the autopsy. But in real time, Nixon knew it in 1974. We don't learn it publicly until 1996.
We're talking to Roger Stone. He's the author of the new book, Nixon's Secrets, The Rise, Fall, and Untold Truth About the President, Watergate, and the Pardon. Roger, we're going to take a break. When we come back, two things I want to talk to you about. I want to continue on this theme, and I want to talk to you about what would have happened if the pardon didn't take place. There's been great debate over the years as to how this country would have handled the trial of a president, and also what would Richard Nixon be doing today if he were president. It's the Cooner Report on WRKO. 617-266-6868. Text 680-680. It is the great WRKO, as the great Jeff Cooner reports right here in this seat every morning at this time slot. Jeff will be back on Monday. My name is Chris Culkeen. It's a pleasure being here today. On the phone with us is Roger Stone. He is the author of Nixon's Secrets, The Rise, Fall, and Untold Truth About the President, Watergate, and the Pardon. Let's talk about the pardon from Vice President Gerald Ford, who had just been made vice president. You already alluded to the fact that you think that was a maneuver, and you alluded to the reasons why they had control over Gerald Ford of his own secrets that were used against him in order to secure that pardon. Making him vice president wouldn't have been enough for him to say, "Hey, look, we're going to nominate you for vice president. You're going to become president, but you need to guarantee that you're going to pardon Richard Nixon." You don't think that would be enough rather than the other theories?
He did so at his own detriment. It probably cost Ford re-election, but it's very clear from the time that he meets privately with General Alexander Haig, who was then serving as Nixon's chief of staff, on August 1st of 1974, that the deal has been cut because Haig tells Ford what Nixon has on him. Had this gone to trial, had there been no pardon,
yes,
then the murder of Diem, the murder of Trujillo by the Kennedy brothers' State Department, the truth about the Kennedy assassination and the Central Intelligence Agency involvement, all would have been on the table. Nixon had deep knowledge of all of that.
Well, why would that? None of those are directly tied to what was happening with the Watergate break-in or the Nixon presidency.
Well, actually, they were. Why were 4 of the Watergate burglars on the ground in Dealey Plaza when Jack Kennedy got killed?
Again, it would be like saying, you robbed this store, but what were you doing in Times Square when that store was
I'm not arguing it would have gotten Nixon acquitted. I'm arguing it would have brought the entire political system down. It would have been very explosive, even 10 years, even 14 years at that point after the fact.
As someone who believes in the strength of this country surviving no matter what, I believe, and it was probably the right decision to pardon him so the country didn't have to deal with the trial of a president. But had it happened, I think we would have survived through it, and it would have shown again the strength of this country. Look, we have every 4 years we have this election. It is a staged changing of the guard, if you will. This would have been certainly. You can't say this was not a dark moment in our history all around. It would have just been another chapter of that moment, and we would have had to find a way to move on from it.
Well, it was very controversial, the pardon at the time, as you know, although many years later the John F. Kennedy Library gave Gerald Ford a medal for his decision to spare the country trial. It would have torn the country in half. Nixon still retained the support of about a quarter of the people, and they would not have liked it. It would have dragged the Congress and the executive branch away from all the national problems at the time for how long? A trial? A year? 18 months? Longer? I think Ford did do the right thing for the country at the time, and it probably cost him his reelection. It became an issue in the '76 campaign against Carter when Nixon announced just before the election that he was going to visit China at the invitation of the Chinese government, and of course that put the pardon back in the newspapers, back in the media just before the '76 election. Major factor, I think, in Ford losing a close one. Coming from behind, but losing a close one.
Richard Nixon certainly made strides for this country. The opening the doors to China brought about tremendous possibilities for the country. He also made strides with in handling Israel. What do you think he'd be doing today with the crises that we're seeing across the board?
Well, Chris, I think you put your finger on it, and that is, sadly, in the ashes of Watergate, we lose all of his accomplishments. He not only ends the war in Vietnam and brings the troops home, he also opens the door to China, at the same time playing the Chinese off against the Soviets to get deep concessions on arms control, saving this country billions and making the world a safer place. He saves the state of Israel in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War when Israel's attacked by surprise by the Syrians and the Egyptians, and they're not prepared. It is Nixon who overrules Kissinger in the State Department and stages the Yom Kippur airlifts of military supplies, bullets, guns, trucks, jeeps, medical supplies that save Israel. He desegregated the public schools without violence or bloodshed. 15% of the schools are desegregated when he becomes president. That number is 85 when he leaves. Gave us the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Environmental Protection Agency, the 18-year-old vote, ends the military draft, desegregates the trade unions, launches the war on cancer. And then there's egregious mistakes. The war on drugs has been an expensive, ineffective mistake. But that was also Richard Nixon, taking America off the gold standard. That's probably also an error from which we still suffer today. So, like all presidents, his record is mixed. But unlike all presidents, I think the many good things he did kind of get lost entirely in the ashes of Watergate. It's as you said earlier, it's a Greek tragedy.
Exactly, and of course, other reports of the brilliance of this man, just as far as his IQ level, not only any of the accomplishments, but he was a really bright guy. But it was those inner demons, and let's say it, outright envy and jealousy that ate him up. That he wanted this success at all costs, that ultimately cost him what he was looking for.
Again, I think it is the scars of the 1960 election. Had he been elected in 1960, I think he'd have been a different president. I think that paranoia is bred by the 1960 experience where he really gets out-hustled. He makes a series of bad mistakes in the beginning of the campaign. Should never have debated, although he did, by all measures, win the last 3 debates, and the 4th debate was his best, which had a TV audience almost as large as the first.
Well, that's a great. You made me think of of course, the debates with Kennedy. For years, people have said if you listened to the debates on the radio, you had a very different opinion than those who watched it on TV.
Nixon makes the classic mistake of thinking that the substance of the debate is what will be important, not the style and the appearance of the debate. Kennedy shows up tanned and fit and ready, wearing a dark suit and a white shirt and a dark tie. Nixon shows up 15 pounds underweight, having been in the hospital for 2 weeks, still on antibiotics, still running a fever, and he's almost as gray as a light gray suit. Kennedy psychs him out in the lighting check, which is kind of like a prize fight weigh-in, when the CBS makeup man says, "Senator Kennedy, will you be using makeup?" No makeup for me," says the senator. Nixon hears that, and then they say, "Well, Mr. Vice President, will you require makeup?" "No makeup for me." Jack Kennedy goes to his dressing room where his private makeup man makes him up. Nixon eschews makeup, and I think Mayor Daley put it best. He said after the broadcast, "My God, they've embalmed him and he's not even dead yet."
We have been talking with Roger Stone. The book is Nixon's Secrets, The Rise, Fall, and Untold Truth about the President, Watergate, and the Pardon. Roger, thank you so much for joining us on the Cooner Report this morning.
Many thanks for having me. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's out there. So I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.
I appreciate it, and good luck with it as well.